The way that we fund schools in Australia is really complex. So I'm going to try and explain to you how it works and why it's broken. Schools are funded according to the Schooling Resource Standard, which is the assessment of the bare minimum of funds required for a school to educate its students. It's based on levels of disadvantage, so schools that have students with higher needs get more money. Under the current arrangements, both the federal and state governments provide funding to both public and private schools. For public schools, the federal government provides 20% of the funding, whilst the state governments and territory governments provide the other 80%. For private schools, it's the reverse. The important thing to note here is that the 80-20 split is entirely made up. So when the Libs and Labor tell you that the federal government can't chip in more than 20%, they're lying. There's no cap. It doesn't exist. The federal government could lift their funding share for public schools to 30 or 40% tomorrow. So you're probably thinking, if the federal government is committing 20% of funding to public schools and the states are contributing 80%, that adds up to 100%. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that outside of the ACT, no state or territory is contributing 80% of the SRS. In the Northern Territory, for example, they only give 55%. And in Queensland, they give 66.5%. So what's going on? Did the states and territories just forget to give the schools the money? Did they run out of money? No. Underfunding is literally part of the plan. The Gonski review, which was commissioned by the Education Minister Julia Gillard in the Rudd government, determined that to make school funding more equitable, overfunded private schools should have excess funding taken away and underfunded public schools should have their funding increased. But they didn't do that. Instead, they decided to progressively take away funds from overfunded private schools and to progressively increase funds to the public ones. So for more than a decade now, we've been on this so-called pathway to fully funding our public schools. But there's a couple of problems with this. The first thing is that apart from the ACT that's meeting its 80% commitment, no other state or territory has ever funded public schools to 80%. Secondly, the evidence shows that the amount of funding going to private schools is actually increasing. In the decades since the Gonski review, combined government per student funding to independent schools has increased by 34%, and to the Catholic sector, it's increased by 31%. But public schools, well, their per student funding has only increased by 17%. In other words, even though governments agreed with the Gonski recommendations that we needed more public money going to public schools and less public money going to private schools, what we've seen is funding increase to private schools at twice the rate of that going to public schools. It's mind-boggling. Right now, federal, state and territory ministers are negotiating the next national school funding deal. If we're going to have any chance of fixing this broken system, we need our public schools to be funded to 100% of the SRS in this agreement. To make sure this happens, we need you to call the Federal Education Minister and to tell him that we need our public schools to be fully funded to 100% of the SRS at the start of the next agreement, which is January 2025.
Authorised by J. McCall, Australian Greens, Canberra.